proprietor of Packing House Wines here in the Claremont Village. Sal is a graduate of the University of La Verne for both his undergrad and his master's. So he's very familiar with SCIAC, which is our athletic conference, and also a native of Southern California. He's a former teacher, and most importantly, he's been in the wine industry for nearly 2 decades. So Sal, I am pleased to hand it off to you.
Hello, everyone. Well, hopefully you guys are all staying safe, comfortable, cozy wherever you are. Just to give you guys a little feedback, if we haven't already met, I see a lot of familiar faces on here, so I'm sure there's a number of you that I've already met, or we've come in contact with somewhere or another. We are in downtown Claremont. I am happy to announce, as far as our business, we haven't had to close down since the quarantine or the stay-at-home orders were released. So fortunately for those of us here in the village, our business model has shifted, but we are still operating as far as our retail shop. Our restaurant just opened up last week, so we are finally doing food to go. If you've ever dined in our location, we're not necessarily set up for to-go orders, but we are up and running, as are more of the village businesses little by little. So the village is trucking along, and I hope that your community is doing well also. Ready to start?
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Also, if you happen to have some of the wine that we sent, feel free to start with a little rosé. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but no reason not to have something in your glass.
Yeah, and if you were able to open them all up, and if you happen to have 4 glasses, it would be great to be able to have them all side by side. If not, we'll go one at a time, one by one. And hopefully, before we get going too far into the wines, nobody got any corked bottles of wine today. It's corked on my end, so hopefully everyone has a good bottle of wine wherever they may be. All right, go ahead. First and foremost, and you can kind of jump through this here. I hope that I'm going to speed through this as quickly as I can, and hopes of not boring you guys too much with the technical details. I've done a couple of these either on both this end or your end, and a lot of times it's difficult to gauge how interested either we are or they are, but I'm going to try to go through as quickly as I can so we can get to the fun part, which is the drinking part, which hopefully some of you are already doing. First, we've done a class at CMC in the past showing Spain as a whole. This evening we are focusing strictly on Rioja, and Rioja is located, if you look on the screen, on the north side of Spain, but more importantly, keep an eye on the proximity to France. If you notice, Rioja and France share a fair close proximity in terms of being able to go from one to the other. That's important in terms of the creation of the wine region in Rioja, and more importantly, the French settlers that left France to make wine in Spain, and which is why there should be some similarities in the wines that we taste today and some of the wines of Bordeaux, whether they be moderate price or higher quality Bordeaux's. You should notice some similarities between A and B, and a lot of that has to do with proximity. In terms of Rioja and the French border is about an hour and change as far as a quick and easy drive from Rioja eastbound. Yeah, I think part of the reason we did Rioja in-house here as one of our packs that we've been doing in terms of keeping our locals here engaged and drinking the alcohol, but Rioja tends to be the greatest value, not just now, but over the last year or two. If this is your first experience to Rioja, you'll quickly see why the quality and the price ratio is so good. And if you've been buying Rioja already, Rioja wine quality ratio, whether it's a fresh young Joven or whether it's a nice aged Gran Reserva, I struggle to find any quality that matches the price point in France, the US, or Italy. So we selected Rioja because we thought they'd be a fun experience, but more importantly because I don't think there's just greater values in the wine world today, regardless of whether you're spending 10, 12, or you're spending $40, $50. And for great Riojas, you shouldn't be spending more than 70 bucks. So that's a great value. One of the first things that I wanted to point out is Rioja has the luxury of having made grapes for over 3,000 years. And this is important in the sense that they pride themselves of having grape growing regions longer than France or Italy. So as far as the larger wine consuming regions of Europe, Spain leads the pack, maybe not in notoriety today, but in production, absolutely. They have about 2.9 million acres of land dedicated to vines. Third, believe it or not, behind cereal and olives. But the difficult thing about that is that there are 2.9 million acres dedicated to vines. Most, about 70% of those vines, are dedicated to old vines. The important thing about that is that in the US, we refer to old vines as a vine that is about 12 to 15 years of age. In Spain, they refer to old vines as a vine that's got 50 to 80 years of age. So if you look there on the screen, that was a picture of a old vine Grenache, I believe, from the Conterno vineyard on my last trip to Spain last year. And their entire vineyard is pretty much big, fat, gnarly vines like this. The beauty of it is that the quality of the wines are amazing. The negative is that everything has to be managed by human touch. No machine harvesting, no machine pruning, no machine scaling back of the vines. So the Passover of this is, you'd be amazed, for as inexpensive as these wines are, a human touches each vine 10 to 12 times a year. And when you're looking at the acreage of vines, it's amazing that the quality and price comes off the vines so, so good. Which in turn makes Spain the third largest wine production or producing country in Europe. Again, now behind France and Italy. Largest in acres planted, third in production scale. The interesting thing about Spain is they started out their wine, or their quality wine production in Spain started about 1850. And it started in 1850 because there was this ugly thing in the wine world, that an ugly pest we call phylloxera. Phylloxera is a bug that attacks the vine at the roots, dehydrating the vine and ultimately killing it within 3 to 5 years. Phylloxera is a pest that the United States gave to Europe. On one of the travels, it made it over to Europe, and specifically it went from England to France, decimating the French vineyard land, killing all the vines in all of France, in which case at this point in the between 1850 and 1860s, Spanish wine producers started to make great wine, and more importantly, French winemakers went down the road to Spain, where they actually had viable vines to make wine. Now, Rioja, it's hard to find. This is a map of Rioja, and most of you received the tasting notes that showed the map as well. But what you'll notice here is Rioja is broken down into 3 sections. Rioja Alta, which is the furthest north of Rioja, Rioja Alavesa, which is in the center, and then at the very bottom, you're going to notice Rioja Baja, or what is currently today referred to as Rioja Oriental. Rioja Baja translates into Rioja Low. So most of the grape growers and winemakers of that region hated the name, because when you talk about Rioja Baja, it sounds as if you're referring to a lower quality grape. They hated that because to some degree, that's a true statement. Most of the wines from Rioja Oriental, or the grapes of Rioja Oriental, are not nearly as good as Rioja Alta, but they've changed the name, so at least in marketing campaigns, they're not viewed as Rioja Baja or Rioja Low. The difficult thing from those of us in the US, we're used to seeing wines that have vineyard designation, AVA designation, single estate. In Rioja, they're just now getting to that point. So you'll never see a wine that says Rioja Oriental on the label, or Rioja Alavesa on the label, or for that matter, Rioja Alta. It'll simply say Rioja. So from our perspective as a consumer, we don't know if we're getting lower quality fruit from Rioja Baja or higher quality fruit from Rioja Alta. Vineyard managers or farmers and winemakers are starting to make the change, but it's going to take a while before they can actually grasp the idea that the rest of the world believes that micro vineyard managing is better than macro. For them, it's volume and consistency, not necessarily micro and quality. But the quality is all good for the most part. A couple things to focus on. Whenever you're buying a wine from Rioja, the primary grape we should always note is Tempranillo. Tempranillo is the main grape that is in Rioja, and more importantly, Tempranillo is a grape that Spain owns. It's a grape that nobody else, it's a grape that Spain basically came up with. Other people are growing it, but Tempranillo essentially owns that grape in terms of its DNA, if you would. There's also Grenache, which is your fruitier, kind of richer flavored wine, which is grown heavily in the Rhone Valley for Châteauneuf-du-Papes, for Côtes d'Aronnes, and in the US, just about anywhere that it's drastically hot. It's a great grape that grows in extreme temperature, and Rioja has very extreme heat. So it thrives very well in Rioja. Graciano is a blend that's also composed into Rioja wines. Masuelo is the other one. The difficulty about Masuelo, if you look at the fourth grape down, Masuelo is actually referred to about 3 or 4 different names in Spain. So you'll see Masuelo, the grape, in kind of 3 or 4 different names. So it makes it very confusing. For the most part with this slide, just remember, Tempranillo is what we're drinking. There's other things in it, but Tempranillo is the base of the wine, whether it's 50, 60, 80, 95. The other stuff are really components that are added to the wine. Some producers are starting to play with the idea of using non-traditional Spanish varietals. In red, there's Cabernet, Malbec, Pinot Noir, which grows horribly in Rioja because it's too hot, but people are planting it to see what they do. And Sauvignon Blanc Chardonnay is growing as alternative whites in Rioja. We'll go through the pyramid real quickly here because this makes things more confusing than anything else. The rosé that you may be drinking already isn't on this grid. Rosé in Rioja, basically, for the most part, they are non-designated wines. Some people are starting to make reserve and Grand Reserve rosés in Spain, believe it or not, but those rarely ever make it outside the country. The first one that you look at is Rioja, which is also known as Rioja Joven. Rioja basically spends about 2 years of aging with no oak expectation. It could have some oak, it could have 0 oak. Generally, these are your cheap bargain wines that you see in the grocery stores, or an amazing value, a great house wine, if you would. In Spain, historically, when they referred to a red wine, they used it synonymously with the word Rioja. So the Spanish would typically just order Rioja, and the bartender or the server would know automatically that meant red wine. Or if they order a red wine, it generally meant they were getting a Rioja. Recently, over the last 50, 60 years, that change has been made more and more with designations like this. The next tier, which is the first red wine that you'll be drinking, is Crianza. And you'll see there it's got 1 year, a minimum of oak aging, 1 year minimum of bottle aging, which is to say you can do 5 and 5, 3 and 4, or 3 and 1. There's no expectations, just minimums. And then Reserva, you see 1 in oak, 2 in the bottle, and Grand Reserva, 2 in oak, 3 in the bottle. One thing to note about this is not a measurement of quality of the wine. It is merely quality of aging. So you can get a Grand Reserva that is absolutely horrible that meets these quality requirements or these aging requirements, but there's no quality designation. Slowly that is starting to change with people calling them Grand Reserva Especial, Grand Reserva Vino del Autor, meaning Grand Reserva vine of the author, or the winemaker, or with a person's name on it. But generally speaking, Crianza, Reserva, Grand Reserva just tells you the age of the winemaking process, not necessarily have anything to do with the quality of the wine you're getting. So be cautious when you're out buying a Grand Reserva thinking that it's supposed to be great. A Reserva may be better than a Grand Reserva. A Crianza, rarely, but can be better than a Reserva. The top 2 tiers is where I would caution you as a buyer to be cautious as to thinking, oh, Grand Reserva, it's got to be great. It's not great. It just means it was aged X amount of years. Right. Here is a trip recently when I went to Spain. This is at one of the wineries. This one's actually very interesting. It shows the mass scale that these wineries produce. These are 222-liter barrels, which is to say about 305 bottles of wine per barrel. And you're going up about 7, 8 high. So you can only imagine if you did the math there, 300 bottles per barrel multiplied back as far as the eye could see. And I'll tell you what, the width is actually shorter than the depth on these rows. This was a cellar or a storage facility that was actually designed by an individual who made boat hangars. So it actually looks like a place where you can actually park a giant yacht. And as you go through on the top, you can't see it here. You may be able to see it up on the upper left-hand corner. There's a crane and everything is automated. It's literally like the claw on your Disney movies where they go down and they grab 6 barrels at a time and then move them from one place to the other. Immensely automated. There were very few people in the winery at the time that I was visiting there. Essentially, the barrels are filled and the barrels are emptied and everything becomes automated. From start to finish, most of these wineries are relying exclusively on automation. The barrels are emptied, the bottles are filled, the bottles are labeled. They put these little foil coverings on the bottles, and they put it inside the box and build the box all within an automated kind of a turnpike of sorts. Real quick, if I can talk real quickly about this wine here. We're not tasting it this evening, but it is VIÑA HERMINIA, one of the oldest Spanish wines. What's important about this wine is if you've ever been in the grocery store and you've seen these little kind of foils that are around Spanish wine and you'd wondered why these are there. In the early 20th century, when Spanish wine became of high quality, what would happen is the Spanish wine would make it into France, and the French importer would realize how good the wine was. So they would drink the wine, put a substitute wine or a lower quality French wine in there, and sell that as Spanish wine. In turn, making the Spanish wine look less good than it was or of lower quality. So this was, to some degree, the Spanish wine's first counterfeiting prevention system. If you ever received a bottle of wine like this that was tampered from the bottom or the base of the bottle, you would know that this was tampered with and you shouldn't trust the purchase of this bottle. Now, this was something that they did too in the late 19th and early 20th century. Today, we could assume that if you get a bottle of wine that was tampered because of this foil, it was just mishandled between point A and point B. I would still assume that it was a good Spanish wine. Good. Sorry, I'm used to going forward. Real quick, I don't want to talk too much about Vino Joven since unfortunately we are not drinking it. It'd be too much wine for one sitting for some of you. For many of you, it would just be a Monday night. But we've got the Joven, which is the first wine, which again is just Rioja, 1 to 2 years of aging, no oak requirement. Most of these wines end up in used barrels, but primarily they're made with stainless steel. Stainless steel fermentation allows the wine to be clean, crisp, bright, kind of like Beaujolais or Beaujolais Nouveau, and also minimizes your cost of operation. So you buy one stainless steel tank, you put the juice in, and in 1 year, 2 years, you push it out and you put it into the market. You sell it for $10 or €6, and everyone is happy. But if you find a wine that says Rioja Joven or just Rioja with no Reserva, Gran Reserva, or Crianza, just assume it's a house wine or table wine. These wines are great starter wines, good drinking wines, good values, good everyday drinking wines across the board. Since we're already drinking, I do want to go through this slide really, really quick. For those of you that want to know how to taste professionally, some of you have seen a slide similar to this if you've been in one of my classes before, but most of you just drink for the sake of drinking. I do the same thing. Sometimes I just want to drink. Unfortunately, my brain doesn't allow it and I end up professionally tasting. But with a wine like this, if you would just kind of humor the process and just tilt your glass in a 45-degree angle, always look from the center out. The darker the wine is, the richer, the fuller body, the more alcohol, the more tannins it'll be. The lighter it will be, the less of those things you will have. I always suggest that people smell the wine before swirling it, and then smell it again. It really opens it up and it identifies fruit flavors on the second go around much more so. Always breathe as much as you can through the nose. Don't just smell it, but really inhale. Try to taste the wine with the nose. And then sip. Of course, I have it. I'm going to spit half the wine that I actually drink. You'll have to forgive me. And lastly, when you taste the wine, I will ask you one or two things. If we could just taste it really quick together, those of you that have wine in your glass. Everyone's been drinking as you have been normally, but what I'd ask you to do on this next sip, let the wine sit on your tongue for about 10 to 15 seconds before you actually drink it. Almost let the rosé warm up in temperature. If you're drinking it at about 40 degrees, let it come to about 43, 42 degrees. Move your tongue around left and right, top to bottom. Allow that wine to really move and agitate around your tongue, and the acid will become brighter. The fruit notes, the strawberry, the watermelons, all those flavors will become a little brighter in note. And then you'll get a little bit of alcohol on the back end. just a touch more so than normal because you've agitated the wine. Same thing we're doing in the glass, you want to do in your tongue. And then the last thing is always think. Now, the difficult thing about wine drinking for most people is we don't think, we just drink, which makes sense. That's why we drink. We don't want to think. But if you would just think about things that this tastes like, that you understand, whether it be bark, campfire, strawberries, watermelons, oranges, things that actually make sense. If I start talking about cassis, currant, black cherries, gooseberries, things that we've never had, it doesn't make sense. But for those of you that are in cold climate areas, you might identify this wine with more cold fruits. Those of you that are in Southern California or hotter climates, you might identify this with strawberries or darker red fruits. What? First wine that we're almost done with, as we've powered through drinking this wine. The first one is Grenache. Now, Grenache, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't necessarily have to have a distinction of quality or aging requirement, I should say. This Grenache, if you look at the bottle, it doesn't identify itself as a Crianza, a Reserva, or a Gran Reserva. It says crisp and elegant. Basically, it's telling you it's a rosé, drink it. Don't think too much about it. What is important about Rioja, and specifically rosés in Rioja, is if you'll notice the color of this wine. It's pink. It's not salmon. It's not orange peel. It's not oniony. It's pink. The important thing to note about Spanish rosés or Rioja rosés, they want to be pink. That's their idea. That's their identification. That's how they identify rosés, as pink wine. The problem with that in the US is that we identify pink as sweet. And therefore, we automatically assume that a pink wine is a sweet wine. A Spanish rosé is not sweet, or it shouldn't be sweet, but it will always be pink. I've added serving temperatures for this wine simply because a lot of times people drink rosés either too cold or too warm. This one's perfect at about 40 degrees, which is right out of the refrigerator. If you were to get a rosé that's of Gran Reserva or Reserva quality, I would suggest drinking that more like a Chardonnay. Drink it at about 55 degrees, or a good Chardonnay, excuse me. A high quality Chardonnay should always be consumed at about 55 degrees, cellar temperature. A high quality rosé should be consumed at the same temperature, 45 degrees. A good rosé, 40 degrees, nice and cold, just short of ice cubes. It's 100 degrees in Southern California. Drink it as cold as you possibly can. But a great little wine, especially for the price point. And on this wine here, I assume they're making a few million cases. Again, doesn't make it good or bad. It just means that's how much they're making. We good? Real quick on rosé, perfect wine pairing with this. I love rosé with your aperitif style dishes, your cheese, your crackers, some salads. Right now, a strawberry arugula salad is on our menu. This would be perfect with that salad. It has about 3 grams per liter sugar, which is to say very little. Just a hint of sweetness to kind of cut the austere nature of this wine. Perfect wine. On a side note with rosé, you should be drinking rosé year round. Rosé is not a summertime wine. It's not a hot weather wine. Rosé is just a wine. Drink it like you do Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, whatever it may be. We good? Good. VIñA HERMINIA. The first red wine that we're drinking here is Crianza. If you were in Spain, they would call it CRIANZA, the way it's phonetically spelled up there. But for the rest of the world, we're going to call it Crianza. Crianza translates to child or young person, which is exactly what this wine is. It's a child. It's a young wine. It's very light, simple, easy drinking. Occasionally, a crianza will go through what is referred to as carbonic maceration, which means you'll get a little bit of bubbles, a little spritziness to it. So if you ever get a wine, a crianza, and it tastes like there's a little bit of bubbles, there's nothing wrong with the wine. That's just the way the winemaker intended it to be. Swirl it around in the glass. Those bubbles will soften up or disappear little by little. Crianza is generally reserved specifically for red wine. There are no white crianzas. There's only white Rioja. Crianza is reserved red wine only. Reserva, Gran Reserva does have a white and red designation. These wines are Tempranillo based. For me, not very complex, very enjoyable. very easy to drink.
There's also a question about why Rioja Baja makes grapes of lesser quality.
The soil. Two things. One, to address the rosé. A small trick that I love doing in really hot regions of rosé, if we can think ahead, I would suggest always to our customers to buy 2 bottles of rosé. Make ice cubes with one, and throw your ice cubes into your rosé wine, which allows your wine to be very cold without diluting it, especially if you're at 100, 110 degree weather, or you're out on the deck on a boat or hanging out. But rosé, yeah, year round, please. It's a great drinking wine. Tempranillo in Rioja Baja doesn't have the quality that Rioja Alta or Rioja Alavesa has, simply because of the soil. Rioja Alta and Alavesa are primarily made of calcareous soil, which is the soil that you find in a lot of places in Paso Robles or Cab Country. The soil is completely different in Rioja Baja than the rest of Rioja, and therefore the quality just doesn't have, the grapes don't have the quality, and a lot of the soils produce grapes with greater aging potential. The soil in Rioja Baja rarely ever produces a grape with greater aging potential, so therefore they're designed as young, youthful, easy wine. So most of your crianzas will inevitably come from Rioja Baja. Rarely do you get a Reserva or Gran Reserva from Rioja Baja. I guess that becomes more of a P&L question. In the U.S., not negatively speaking, but in the U.S., we need as much vigor on the vines to produce as much wine, which in turn produces cash flow. A lot of the properties in Spain are grandfathered in. They're second, third, fourth, fifth generation farmers, which they don't necessarily have the overhead. And at some point, if you're producing 1 to 2 clusters per vine, the vine is probably unhealthy and should have been taken out of the ground a long time ago. Most old vines, even your 70, 80, 90-year-old vines that are in Spain or the Rhone or Baja California, are still producing about 5 or 6 clusters of grapes. The difference is that the clusters are very tiny. Just for reference, if you could think about the grapes you get at Costco that are about a nickel size, the old vine grapes that you would get out of these Tempranillo vines are about a half of that size. So you're getting a lot less production, but you're getting much more quality. So it really depends on what the market demands. People have no problem when they see the word old vine or VIA in France, paying more for it because they know it's going to be a better wine. It just depends how much the producer can actually recoup from that production. Good. Thank you, by the way, for the questions. And please do not hesitate to ask or throw them in the chat. I know it sometimes can be intimidating. I've been in these with winemakers, and I'm afraid to ask questions, so I know what it feels like, but do not hesitate to ask any questions. I love Spanish wines. They're my top 5 favorite. They're in the top 3. I love Spanish wine. Price quality ratio, you can't go wrong. The next wine that you have here is the Marqués de MURRIETA. Real quick, to step back real quick, the one that we had earlier, the VIñA HERMINIA. This is a fairly young winery. I believe it was founded in the 1970s. The founder of this wine is Emilio Lustau, which is a sherry producer. L-U-S-T-A-U, Lustau. So the Emilio Lustau, who owns sherry vines and makes a sherry, recently made the HERMINIA in the late 1970s is what I believe when the winery was founded, which is important in the sense that earlier I spoke of vines coming into their own or into production of larger scale quality in the 1850s when phylloxera hit France. The French winemakers made their way to Rioja to make wine. The important thing about that one is we are now moving on to wine number 2, or red number 2, Marqués MURRIETA. Marqués MURRIETA was founded in 1852. So Murrieta was one of those wines that originally was founded with French winemaking techniques, French winemakers, immigrants that made their way from France over to Spain. And this is the oldest winery that we will be tasting today. Campo Viejo, HERMINIA, and Cáceres were all founded in the 1960s or 70s. What was important in the 1960s is hygiene. Winemakers in Spain all of a sudden found hygiene to be a valuable winemaking practice tool to make better quality wine. So a number of wines that came out in the 1960s and 70s were of great quality, and more people started making wine and creating wineries. Hence, there was a huge uptick in wineries being created or established in the 1970s. Marqués Murrieta was not one of those. This was founded in 1951. This is a Reserva. One of the absolute best values, I hope you agree with me as you taste to it, but one of the best values in the market. I've had this wine for $20 on the shelf for about the last 7 or 8 years. Hasn't gone up in price at all. My cost hasn't gone up, and the consumer cost hasn't gone up. You'll find this occasionally for about $23, $25 out and about, or in the grocery store where they tell you it's $50, but they're selling it to you for $25. It's a great wine for $20, and it is a Reserva that doesn't have necessarily nearly the bottle or barrel aging as it is a 2015. So it's been barrel aged and bottle aged for 4 years total. But a wine that has that much aging and more so aging potential for $20, it's a delicious wine.
And Sal, this one did have, was Wine Spectator 2019 Top 100 Wine of the Year, I think.
14. Yeah, the 14 was in Wine Spectator's Top 100. The 15 was not, but regularly, Marqués de Cáceres Reserva, regularly rated 90 to 94 points by whoever you want to believe, whether it's Wine Spectator, Advocate, Enthusiast, Suckling, or there's just too many reviewers today to keep track of them all. When it comes to reviewers, I would suggest if you follow them, follow one. Don't follow Wine Enthusiast and Wine Advocate. Follow Wine Enthusiast if that's who you believe, then follow them regularly so that you get to understand their point system and more so your palate understands their point system. If you believe that Parker gave this a 95, but Spectator gave it a 90, and you associate your palate with Wine Spectator, then believe it's about a 90-point wine. This wine here has a little bit more tertiary characteristics. Compared to the HERMINIA, more simple red fruit, red cherry notes, Bing cherry, a little chocolate. Yes.
Why do Spanish wineries consistently age in American oak, whereas French oak is used elsewhere?
That's a great question. I didn't talk too much about that earlier because I didn't want to bore people during the technical aspect of it, but I love that question. The reason the Spanish, specifically Rioja, age their wines in American oak is because when the wineries originally got started in the 1850s, the Spanish were trying to buy French oak, but even today, French oak is immensely expensive. To buy French oak in the US here, it's about $1,300 to $1,700 a barrel. To buy American oak, it's about $700 to $800 a barrel. So somewhere between 30 to 50% off, depending on which cooperage you're looking at. The funny thing about that is it was cheaper for the Spanish to import American oak than it was for them to import French oak. And as the winery was young in its existence, they went with the cheaper route and they went with American oak. And then fast forward 100 years later, something happened with regards to its typicity or the style that the Spanish were always making wine. And those notes had vanilla notes, had spice notes, had all the nutmeg that American oak has. French oak does not have any vanilla flavors to it. If you ever taste a wine that's made in French oak, you should have 0 vanilla flavors. This is a wine that is typical in blind tastings. And as soon as you identify vanilla in this wine, you know that this wine was made in American oak. So the Spanish started using American oak primarily because of cost, strictly because of cost. More importantly, by the time they realized they could have used French oak or they should be using French oak or could afford using French oak, the American oak was so pivotal in the style of Spanish wines that it was too late to turn back. And the oak was also a little older. New American oak imparts a very heavy flavor to any wine. The Spanish don't want that heavy American flavor in a new barrel. So they use more of an assemblage or a blending of multiple barrels, which is why in that picture you saw thousands of barrels, primarily because you get new American oak with used oak or neutral oak, which is 10 years old. You blend them together and you get this great flavor, very harmonious, soft, balanced, pretty, more of a European style wine in terms of its delicate nature. And that was the audience that the Spaniards were trying to attract. They weren't interested in selling wine to Americans. They were interested in buying American oak, but selling wines to the French. The beauty of this wine here, I don't know if it has the notes on there. I think this wine is a great wine for $20 that I would age for anywhere from 7 to 10 years. And you can't do that with any American wine, very few French. You can do it with Italian wines. But for $20 to be able to have this wine and be able to save and age it for 10 years, it's an absolute gem and a value. And this is a wine, I believe he had the production on there. I erased it off my notes, but I believe he made 2 million bottles of this wine. That's how much was made, which to me raises a strong argument when people insist on saying micro means quality. This wine to me is pure quality with macro production, and I just don't think you can get a better wine for the money, and especially for the production. Marqués MURRIETA does not make a Gran Reserva under this label. They jump from this wine at $20 a bottle or so to their Marqués Higuey, and the Higuey is based off their founder, and that one's about $70, and that is their Gran Reserva Especial, is what they refer to it. But again, this wine is absolutely delicious. And you see the blend there at the bottom, primarily Tempranillo with Graciano, Mazuelo, and Grenache as well. Yes, let me explain the video. Which video is it? All right, we're going to shift onto a quick video of a wine, not necessarily any ones that you're drinking. And not to be an advertisement for this one, I love Lopez Heredia. If you can find this wine in your market, I strongly encourage you to buy it. This is one of those weird anomalies where the crianza is about 10 years old. So earlier we had a VIñA HERMINIA crianza, which I believe was a 2014? 2016. So VIñA HERMINIA crianza was a 2016. The Heredia crianza is a 2009. So we're talking a 10-year-old bottle of wine, and we sell for $25. This is the Lopez Heredia Gran Reserva 2006. So this wine is 14 years of age. The video you're going to watch is how they rack or how they clean the wine from the lees. The wine will be aged on a barrel, and there's a bunch of sediment that sits on the bottom. And rather than filtering it with any kind of chemical agent or any kind of pork fat or egg or science, essentially what they do is they drain the wine out of one hole, and then they drain the gross lees out of another hole. The interesting thing about that one is that wine is constantly exposed to oxygen. Twice a year, that wine is racked for 14 years. So that wine sees oxygen about 25 to 30 times, depending on how often that barrel gets touched, which means when you open this bottle of wine, generally speaking, people think the wine will go bad within 1 to 2 days. This wine is constantly exposed to oxygen, so if you open it, it should taste the same for about a week plus, which is great for those of us that don't necessarily want to drink a full bottle of wine, or more importantly, if we break into that second bottle of wine and can't finish the second bottle of wine.
Sal, can you talk about what it means to rest on the lees?
Yeah, real quick, in terms of wine production, all grapes are red in color. All grape juice is white in color. What happens during the production of wine is you press the juice off of the grapes, grape skins, grape pulp as we call it, and what comes out is white juice. So that wine goes out to market, it would be a white wine masquerading as a red wine, or call it Pinot Blanc, or a Blanc de Noir, excuse me. What happens is you've got all this white juice here, and you have the lees, or the junk, the stuff, the stems, the seeds, the skin, all the extra stuff here that's very dark and purple in color. After the wine has been fermented here and all the alcohol has been converted, you reintroduce the water back to the lees, and you age them together to extract that color, extract the tannins, extract the flavor that the lees are on. Now you have this wine, you've got this barrel, a full barrel, where half of it has the lees and the other half has the juice. You can mix it up with kind of like a tool that you move inside with a kind of a cap at the end, and you mix it back and forth, or you can move the barrel from location to location, or you can move the juice from this barrel to a different vessel. But at some point you have to clean the lees, or you'll get a glass of wine that has kind of cement or sediment, as you would see in a glass. So you get those red wines that have the little bit of chunks at the bottom of the wine. Those are your sediments. But if you didn't clean the lees or the pulp off of the wine before bottling it, you would essentially have a tenth of your glass filled with what looks like potato hash or cereal, wet cereal. So they rack them and clean them from the lees because you no longer need them any longer. It's kind of a filtering process, if you would. So what they're doing here is a filtering process that was created in the 1850s that they continue to use today. Very labor intensive, which is why this wine is not necessarily one of the more inexpensive wines, but has the absolute most amazing history in Rioja.
Sal, why is that a Crianza, even though it's 14 years old at this point? Why wouldn't it be a Grand Reserva now?
Because again, Crianza tells you the minimum aging. 1 year in the bottle, 1 year in the barrel. You can age it as long as you possibly want. What's important there is at what point do you release it in terms of quality and price. So again, you can have a Reserva that's been aged for 3 years total, and you can have a Crianza for 10 years. They call it Crianza because they believe that to be their lower quality juice. Lopez Heredia does believe that their Reserva has better juice than their Crianza. But it's labeled Crianza because it is their lower aged wine of the three that they make. So it's more vineyard specific than it is quality specific for them.
Everything is done by hand, non-technological things.
It's kind of hard to see, but if you can look, there is a tube where the wine is kind of coming through as we get closer. So the wine is actually being drained out of one barrel, constantly exposed to oxygen, and being drained into a second barrel. And then it will be drained back into a third barrel for longer aging. And if you see at the bottom here, there are two holes. One of them, the higher one, is where the wine comes out of. The lower one is where the lees come out of. So essentially, they're filtering or cleaning the wine for you in terms of long-term aging. And these barrels inside this winery are neutral, 100% neutral. No new barrels come in. Well, new barrels do come in here, but Heredia really loves old barrels. Their wine, some of their reserve wine goes through the original barrels that were made in the 1850s with holes, so there's constant repairs and attachment, but oak that embarks no flavor necessarily directly into the wine, but more composition and style into the wine. And if you make your way to Rioja, Lopez Heredia is a must. It's an absolute must. No trip to Rioja is complete without a visit to Lopez Heredia. They don't always let you take a tour of the winery because it is very old and not the safest place for visitors, but occasionally they do open up the facility for you to actually visit the winery itself. Moving on to the third and final wine, and if you're still on and don't have the wine, don't worry, you can find this wine because this wine does have great distribution across the world. This is Marqués de Cáceres Gran Reserva. It's a 2011, and this one you'll note a lot more tertiary, what we refer to as tertiary characteristics. Basically that means age-worthy characteristics. More dried brush, oak, dust, potato skins. That's a weird one, you probably don't get it, it just came to me. Think of when you're shaving the potato off the potato and you get that smell on your hands. It's distinctly what I got on here. When you're around Soms, we kind of get a little in our own head as to what we smell. If you smell brick, mud, dirty diaper, that's what you smell. The important thing to note about all these wines, if you look at the serving temperature, we always say room temperature with red wines when people don't realize room temperature is about 70 degrees, not room temperature in your house that could be 85 degrees in the middle of summer. There is nothing wrong with refrigerating your red wine. If you have them in a wine cellar or a wine storage facility, bring them out a little earlier before you drink them. If you get home from a bad day and you pop the cork because you have to drink and you forget to chill it down, just put the rest of the wine in the refrigerator and then just pour yourself as you go along. But the cooler this wine is, closer to 68 degrees, the more cherry notes and fruit flavors will actually shine on this wine. I didn't talk too much about white reservas or white Gran Reservas. White Gran Reservas are not found too often because if you noticed, they tend to be aged for a long period of time, and white Reservas are constantly exposed to oxygen. Even if they're aged in the barrel has staves, and in those staves, there is constant oxygen that can get in or out of those barrels. So they're constantly oxidized, and for most people, they don't like oxidized white wines. They have a little bit of a funky, kind of a dried hay, kind of a barnyardy, kind of a weird wet bread note to it. So most people don't care for Gran Reservas. I love them because they're super funky. For those of you that are thinking about orange wines, whether you or your kid or your nephew or niece start talking about orange wines because they're all the hipster rage right now that everyone wants to drink natural or orange wines, those can be really funky to enjoy because they are oxidized and natural without any kind of additives, which sometimes calms the wine down and makes the wine a little bit more enjoyable. This one here, it absolutely is not natural when you're making as much production as these guys are. But again, exceptional quality and exceptional age worthiness. And more importantly, if you have a bottle of Rioja from a birth year, whether it's yours or your kids, you can buy, I bought a 1964 about 3 years ago for 55 bucks. Nothing. If you buy a 1964 from Napa, it'll cost you a lot more and it won't be nearly as good. We good? I'm curious real quick, and it's going to be hard. You'll have to raise your hand or pop your hand up, but I always do this when I do one of the classes. Having tasted the first two reds, we'll exclude the rosé and exclude the last one. But out of curiosity, just within the first two, the Crianza and the Reserva, raise your hand if you enjoyed the Crianza, the first red, over the Reserva. Not a test, just curious. Eight of you reserved. Can we assume that the balance of the audience preferred the Reserva over the Crianza? Yes, no, maybe so? Yeah. And don't be afraid to say, give me a thumbs down if you didn't like any of the wines. You didn't like any of the first two. The Crianza was okay, the Reserva was okay, it's not what you're looking for. There's a lot of wine out there. You don't have to fall in love with Rioja as much as I love Rioja. I just love the fact that I can buy what I consider a great wine for 20 bucks.
Suzanne just wants you to know that she's a wino and she loves them all. And thank you very much. A few people really liked number two, but a few people really don't understand the drinking dirty diapers.
That's not me. I don't have kids. Sorry. I just said if that's what you smell, that's what you smell. Again, I smelled potato skins, and for some people, I saw a couple of faces. They're like, potato skins? It's just what you understand. We have to understand that smelling and tasting is a personal expectation. I can't tell you that there's Bing cherries here if you've never had a Bing cherry. In New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs, people always talk about gooseberry, yet no one's ever seen or tasted a gooseberry. And how many people will say, oh, it smells like gooseberry, but they have no idea what a gooseberry is. I struggle with my flowers. The difference between acacia, violet, chamomile, sometimes I just don't get them, so I don't call them as descriptors. Some of you with kids might identify dirty diapers in this wine. Not a good thing, not a bad thing. It's just how you identify it.
All right, we have a question from Jan Turner, who raised her hand. Jan, go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Assuming that was your raised hand for a question.
Well, sorry, I wasn't sure
what you
were here, Evan. I did have a question.
Oh, okay, you're just raising your hand for the Crianza.
Yes.
You love all three wines. That's also a good response. All of the above is a great response. Real quick, on these wines, I think they would all pair the same way. All red wines would pair identically. To me, any kind of lamb, pork, red dish, any stews. The beauty of Riojas is they're immensely versatile. You can do it with chicken, you can do it with steak. A lot of times red wines don't go well with chicken and don't go well with steaks in certain scenarios. But this wine to me is soft enough that it will carry well with the chicken dish, and it's heavy enough that it'll also complement a steak dish. If you're doing a big, heavy, fatty ribeye, you may want to go with the Gran Reserva. but the crianza, I think, fits perfectly with any or most dishes out and about.
All right, we have a question from Julius in Chino Hills. Is the Tempranillo grape comparable to Cabernet Sauvignon?
I think it was misleading. I believe one of the slides or one of the tasting notes may have said something regarding if you like Cabernet, you'll love Tempranillo. I read that a lot. In a lot of the readings that I do when I'm studying Rioja, they say, well, if you like Cab, you'll love Tempranillo. Yes, but no. If you like Cab, you'll love Tempranillo. If you like Cab, Tempranillo from Rioja is not the same thing. So it's kind of difficult to understand it. Tempranillo from Ribera del Duero, amazing, very, very similar to a Cabernet. Tempranillo from Rioja, more like Pinot Plus. So for people that come in and say, I'm looking for something a little bit heavier than a Pinot Noir, but I can't do a Cab or a Zin or a Syrah. To me, Rioja Tempranillo is Pinot Plus. Rioja, Ribera del Duero can be a Cab. So to answer your question, yes and no.
Do you know anything about the tariffs on Spanish wine, Sal? Tom McKay built a Spanish charcuterie board, and the meats, cheese, and nuts were all very expensive. Whereas when they went to Spain, the food was reasonably priced.
I'm going to take that as two questions. The European wines were taxed heavily recently on the first wave, and then they stopped what was considered to be a second wave of tariffs because of the current situation. So French wines and Spanish wines have all taken about a 20% increase across the board. A lot of distributors and importers have said they were going to eat a little bit of that cut all the way down. So if a Spanish wine took a 20% tariff increase in the last year, the importer may have taken a 5% hit. The distributor may have taken a 5% hit, and we may take a 5% hit, but ultimately your Spanish and French wines are going to go up. Unfortunately, it goes across the board. The second part of your question, you're absolutely right. And a lot of people say this when they go to Spain. They come back and they say, I can get a great glass of wine in Spain for €3, and I can't do that here in the US. There's two parts to that response. Number one, a glass of wine in Spain is 3 to 4 ounces. A glass of wine in the US is 6 ounces. So you have to double your prices automatically there from €3 to €6, which is still not a huge expense. But the second thing is that we have to understand the cost of the average income in Spain is very low. So most Spaniards will not buy a €4 glass of wine. That's expensive. For us, because of our earning potential here in the US, when we go to Europe, we're prepared to spend €4 or €6 or €8 or maybe even €10 on a glass of wine, because when we go to the local restaurant, whether it's a small or a franchise, we're going to spend $10 to $15. And in Spain, most Spaniards would never spend €10 on a glass of wine. So the wines in Spain are always going to be more inexpensive simply because that's the audience that they deal with. Secondly, the Spanish government does subsidize a lot of the farmers, which reduces the grape prices, which in turn reduces the wine prices. So I hope that answers as to me, a two-part question, but that's, yes, the tariffs have gone up, but I still think the Spanish price and quality wine is still far below what you're going to find in the U.S. market for Napa wines or for Sonoma wines.
Question about Tempranillos in the U.S. versus Spain. How do you kind of rate the U.S. Tempranillos, both by themselves, but also as compared to Spain? And then I have actually one of my classmates from Texas asking specifically about Texas Tempranillos, if you know anything about those.
I'm going to hit the Texas question first. I know Texas is making good wine. I have Texas customers that swear to me that they're making good wine. I don't taste a lot of Texas good wine. I've tasted 5 wines from Texas, one of which I thought was good. I haven't been to Texas wine country, so I don't necessarily know how their Tempranillos are, but I'm guessing the topography of Texas and Rioja are very similar, or Spain. So I would guess the Tempranillo in Texas would grow much better than Pinot Noir in Texas, or even Cabernet in Texas. Cabernet relies heavily on the soil, not necessarily the external terroir, be it the wind and the sun and the climate. So I would say Texas Tempranillo, I would not be afraid of tasting or buying those wines if they were moderately priced. American Tempranillo, not nearly. It'll never be as good as Spanish Tempranillo. They've been they've got the vines that have been planted centuries ago, and they're making amazing wines. And our Tempranillo vines, which are still very, very good, are still very, very young. I think the U.S. has a better chance of making great Malbec than Tempranillo. However, for the friends up in the Northwest, Washington State Tempranillos are very, very, very good. Washington has that dry, hot climate in eastern Washington, and that's the climate that Tempranillo grows well in. A lot of times I think of where the wine grows and what grapes should grow in that area. And if you're going to grow Tempranillo next to the ocean, that's a horrible place for Tempranillo, because that's not where Tempranillo thrives. So California Tempranillos, we have a moderate climate. They just don't grow well unless you have a small micro pocket someplace, either in Contra Costa, Sierra foothills, or inland heavily like it is in Washington. But for me, if I were to spend $20 on American Tempranillo or Spanish Tempranillo, the Tempranillo, 10 out of 10 times probably. That answer those?
Perfect. Any other questions? Anybody want to raise their hand and actually ask it on screen?
Now that we've had a glass or two of wine, it should be easier to just shout it out. You can do the last slide. Yeah. Oh, there was a trip just to yeah. Here is real quick. Here are some of my tips on visiting Rioja. Like I said, I was just there late last year, and I know whenever we're visiting another country, it's incredibly difficult to figure out whether Yelp or TripAdvisor or online who has what, and how do they prepare us for those trips. Here are some really simple suggestions that I would make. If you're planning, I know right now it's very difficult to figure out where we're going to be in the next 6 months, even a year or two. But if you decide to make your way over to Spain, I absolutely agree with the person that called earlier. The trip to Spain, the food in Spain is some of the best you're going to find in the world, and more importantly, some of the best values you're going to find when it comes to food in Spain. San Sebastian, the gastronomic capital of Europe, has some amazing food. If you're going to visit Rioja, rent a car. If you don't have a driver, renting a car is immensely simple, whether you're heading out of Bilbao or whether you're heading out of Madrid. Flying into Madrid is absolutely scary, almost as bad as Rome. But flying to Madrid and get out of Madrid, it's about an hour and a half outside, and you're in a completely desolate open road. Very, very simple and safe to get from point A to point B, an hour and a half outside of Madrid or an hour south of Bilbao. Second, where to stay. There's two great cities in Rioja. Logroño is the capital of Rioja. It is big. It is populated. It is crowded. If that's the scene you like, if you want to be in an area where you got to pay 25 euros for parking because parking doesn't exist in the city, it's a great place to be. A lot of restaurants, a lot of shopping, a lot of entertaining venues, a lot of wonderful things to do. If you want the small, quiet, comfortable vacation, Haro is the place to be. Haro is maybe about the size of the city of Claremont. It's tiny, it's quaint, it's quiet. In Haro, there is an area called the train station wineries. There's about 6 wineries near the train station, which is why they call them train station wineries. It wasn't designed for tourism, but that was designed for functionality of the winery. You make wine, you got to ship wine. Best way to do it is put it on a train. So now they have, as opposed to cargo trains, they have transportation trains. So you can take a train from Madrid, you can take a train from Bilbao or any major city in Spain, and make your way to Haro, spend a day in Haro, and you can exit out of Rioja and be able to see some big wineries and also some small wineries without ever having to rent a car within the city limits of Haro. It is very, very simple. How to get around Rioja? Again, renting a car. If you don't want to rent a car in Madrid, rent a car in Haro, and you can kind of make your way out, or rent a car in Logroño. Here's the interesting thing. Visiting wineries, you have to make an appointment to just about any winery you go to. But more importantly, the Spanish are prepared for visitors. Every time I go to France, I need at least 2 months of conversation before getting anything done. You email someone in France, they email you a week later. You respond to them the same day, they email you a week later. The speed of the French tourism is about as fast as the speed of the French. Spain is not that way. You email Spain, they reply to you quickly. They reply to you in English. They have English ambassadors. They are prepared for Westerners. They want Americans to go there. They want tourists to go there. It's very safe and very comfortable and very welcoming. The best season to go, you've got a great season between May and October. I would suggest September. The major tourist season is gone. Their harvest hasn't started. September is a great time to go. If you go in October, they're in harvest. They'll take you, but they really don't want to see you, and you may be stuck behind a tractor that goes 5 miles an hour, and it'll take you 45 minutes to take 1 mile of drive. But October was great. May is also fantastic. And really, you don't need more than 2 to 3 days unless you love Rioja. I could have stayed there for a week. It was absolutely fantastic. And watching the mom and pop wineries one day and then going to this massive machine of automation the next day was fascinating, just to see how in one town you could have a winery making 10 million cases, and in the next town they're making 1,000 cases. It's absolutely amazing. And then check out some local festivities. Coincidentally, I happened to be there at the festivity in Logroño last year, which was the festivity that kicks off harvest. It was just a mere coincidence, but basically the entire city shut down. When you talk about Logroño, a city that's about as big as LA and as populated as LA, empty with cars, everyone was walking to the downtown festivities. They had a giant stage and bands and music playing, and it started raining on us. Not a single person left. But the festivities or the festivals was a fantastic visit. So for me, if I were to go back, I'm absolutely going back in September, and I'm absolutely going back for a week to Rioja. And hopefully you guys will find time or a possibility to make your way to Europe and stop into Rioja.
Val, we have a question about COVID-19. How do you think COVID-19 will affect the global wine scene?
There's a number of changes that I've seen from the grassroots level here, and from what I've heard from distributors and importers. Number one, we are in a quality-based business in our location. And for us, I want to taste as much wine as I can before I bring it into my shelf, because I don't trust the quality of the wine that gets in the bottle until I taste it. The grocery stores, they think differently. They have contracts with wineries, and those SKUs need to be in the winery themselves. What I've noticed is it's incredibly difficult for me to get samples for wines to taste anymore. It's incredibly difficult for sales reps to make their way around. Right now, a lot of what I'm seeing is we are buying based off of trust, just like you at home are. My customers are buying wine from me because they trust that we're doing everything we can to make sure that those bottles leave here safely and that they're quality driven. I'm buying from my distributors based off of what I know. The beauty of it is I've been doing this for a long time, and I think I know quite a bit about the wines. But if you're a new wine shop, or if you're a new buyer, or if you're a new manager in a grocery store and you don't know the quality of a producer or the vintage, you're going to buy based off of price. So that's making it very, very difficult. At the distributor level, I've been struggling to get wines from one distributor who's in San Francisco, because they only allow 4 people in their warehouse at a time to keep their social distancing practices intact. So they don't have nearly as many employees in the facility. So they're not shipping as much wine out. My drivers are struggling to get product into us as well, in the sense that they have to follow the practices as well as far as staying safe and clean. And I hear from my importers that it's difficult for them because, again, the importers follow the same practices that I do. They want to go to Spain, taste the wine, identify its quality, place the order, and bring it back to the US. Now that order's been placed with the expectation of X amount of wines being sold, and right now we have no idea what X is today. That number, as far as the expectation of wines that I'm going to sell, has nothing to do. It's a made-up number. And I can only imagine what an importer who normally buys a container of wine is going through, in the sense that they expect to sell a container every 3 months, and now they may sell a container every 6 months, or they may sell it in a week. We don't know. We have no idea. People are drinking. I don't want to say they're drinking more than ever before, but the reality is many of us are home, and 5 o'clock starts early for most of us. And it's easy to make our way through a bottle of wine when we start at 4 o'clock. And if there's 2 of us, it gets easier. There's nothing wrong with that. We're not driving anywhere. We're treating ourselves, and the day can be challenging for some of us. So we want a good glass of wine at the end of the day. But I don't know if that means I should buy more wine or that just means you're drinking this week. So I think the importers have a very difficult task to determine how much to import going forward. Yes.
So someone asked about storing wines. They apparently opened all 4 and they can't finish them. So how do you recommend storing the open bottles?
If you don't have any inert gas to pour inside of the wine, which most of us don't, so I assume it's a no. I always tell people whenever you open a bottle of wine, you're not going to finish, especially like today you open all 4. I would say just put the cork back in the bottle and put it in the refrigerator. This is food. This is produce in a sense. If you put it in the refrigerator, it actually slows down the deterioration process. And that's not for today. I would say all the time. At the end of the night here at work, we actually put all of our reds in the refrigerator. And by putting them in the refrigerator, it slows down that deterioration process. And you'll get an extra day or 2 out of these wines. They do change a little bit as they go through. And we opened all 4 here. And in all honesty, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drink the best wine first and the worst wine last. So there shouldn't be too much of a storage issue with the wine that you like the most. And with the rosé or the crianza, those were your least favorite or the lower end of your quality spectrum. I would say those will last 3 to 5 days if you refrigerate them fine. If you bring them out and forget to bring them to room temperature, just run them under warm water and bring them back to room temperature and you'll be fine drinking them. Don't throw them in the microwave. That's probably not a good idea.
We are approaching our time, but I know, Sal, there's one more video you wanted to share. Are you ready for that video?
Logroño?
The winery with all the barrels?
Oh, yeah. And we're going to show one last video here. This is the automated video of the winery that I was standing next to the barrels, just so you can see the massive nature of what this winery was. And you'll see up at the top, you should be able to see some of the clouds if they sneak up, that kind of brings and collects the barrels. This is at Bodegas LAN, and it's just amazing the volume of wine that is put out, which if you think about it, if you're making 10 million cases every year, you have to sell 10 million cases every year. That's in part why the price, I believe, is so inexpensive. Wine does us no good if it's just sitting on the shelf. We have to move it, and we have to price it to move. So I think that's why Spanish wines are a great value right now.
All right, we are a few minutes past our time. I wanted to thank Sal Medina. Thank you so much. And we are recording this, so if anyone needs to see it or watch again, or if you didn't quite get your wine, thank you for your flexibility. You can review this later. In the
email and phone number.
And sure.
Oh, real quick, I know that you guys are heading out, but if you are going to watch this or if you have questions, do not hesitate to reach out. We are here. I'm here 7 days a week these days, but those of you on the East Coast or Central Times, you can always call and leave a message. You can look us up online, or you can always email me at sal@packinghousewines. I have no problem answering questions. I always joke, you don't have to buy wine from me. If I can answer a question to make it easy for you to buy good wine, I'd be more than happy to answer your questions wherever you may be. So don't hesitate if you didn't ask a question, or if you were embarrassed to ask the questions, or if you're curious about a particular wine and you're at the grocery store, you can always just send the email while you're there. And if I catch it, I'll reply. If not, you can go back to the grocery store the next day. We're here to help.
All right, thank you. And thanks, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy. We're going to do another wine tasting in a couple of weeks. Go ahead and check that out on the website. Also, if you have a few minutes and you want to chat with Sal, you can unmute yourself and we can just do a little quick back and forth. Otherwise, thanks everyone. This was the week that we were supposed to have commencement for our seniors. We're going to start a brief campaign to support them starting tomorrow, so hopefully you can join us. Otherwise, stay safe, stay healthy. We hope to see you around the virtual universe.
Thank you, guys.
Feel free to unmute yourself, ask the question, wave.
Domino effect. Pum, 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 pum.
I know. Well, the Walters wanted to talk. Let's unmute the Walters. Walters, you're
yeah.
Wow, you're the bomb. Woo!
You have to he can't actually hear you because his volume's off. Turn your volume on.
No, sorry, Josh.
Yay, Sal! It's and the wine is so good.
Yeah, this is really good.
Not too bad, right?
Like number 1 and number 3.
The rosé and the
Murrieta.
MARQUÉS de MURRIETA.
I tell you, for 20 bucks, I don't know. You just can't get a better wine for me. It's delicious.
Very bold.
Well,
Yes.
it's not, the second one I think is more bold than the third one.
It tastes more dirty diaper.
There you go. You have kids, you know dirty diaper smell.
Yes, I think that's a very good comparison.
What in the world? What in the world?
Yeah.
You could have said cow manure for those of you that are farming, or, you know.
Okay.
Earthy.
Earthy.
Very,
Look at Trump.
very dirtish.
That's true.
Well, I like the rosé though. That was a nice rosé.
Yeah.
That rosé for the money.
I went back to the rosé.
I like the fruity. I like fruity wine, so I like the earlier reds rather than the Crianza. That was nice.
Sal, you said you can drink rosé all year long. We're in New York, and you cannot drink it all year long. We have in the negative Celsius degree snow, etc. It's just not appropriate to drink rosé in the winter in New York.
Yeah, room temperature.
Put it next to the heater.
Pull it out. Yeah.
It's not the thing to drink in the winter in New York. So for the New Yorkers, like you Californians, you shouldn't be discriminating against us. Post CMC East Coast.
So Sal, how do they say train station in Spanish? You say train station wineries in the
There you go. I was trying to think of how they set it up there. Yeah, estación. I don't know.
Ferrocarril.
He said it.
I'm trying to picture the station in Haro to see if it had something different, but I guess that would be the closest thing. Yeah, you get into that Basque country where there's a lot of different. There's Spanish and then there's
Basque. I wouldn't be able to.
Yeah.
Oh, is this Basque?
Almost.
Close. There was one vineyard that I visited that part of the vineyard was in what they called Spanish country, and the other part was in Basque country. It was very interesting because in terms of how they harvested that vineyard, they had to get different employees. It was weird.
Was this Catalonia or is it Basque or it's in between?
This was down in the northern part of Rioja Baja, Rioja Oriental. That kind of crossed over, and there was a lake right there, and the tour guide that took us alongside like, that's Basque country. Don't go over there. So it was interesting. It's just an interesting divide in that part of the world in terms of separating themselves.
Well, Spain is a very regionalistic country. I have actually lived in Spain. I've been there almost 10 times. And they identify very strongly with their regions, more than even the country as a whole. Yeah, so absolutely. That's something I think to note. I speak Spanish, I'm bilingual, I have a family there. And it's just a very fascinating country and incredible. For those of you who haven't been there, the food is incredible, the wine is incredible, the people are warm and welcoming. One thing I would say to you, Salva, that I don't agree with is, I mean, I'm bilingual. No one speaks English in Spain. It's really unusual to find an English-speaking person.
I went to Barcelona and thought I would be practicing my Spanish, and I realized I was not in Spain, I was in Catalonia.
Catalonia, no.
It's completely different.
Yeah. Well, my dad's from Barcelona, and I went there with him, and I said I wanted to go to Madrid. He goes, what do you want to go to Madrid for?
I couldn't get out of Madrid fast enough. It's the same as Paris. I love Paris, but when I land in Paris, I can't wait to go to Beaune. You just got to get out to Burgundy. I landed in Madrid. I had to get out to wine country.
Yeah.
Too many people.
Yeah.
Crowded.
I don't agree. Madrid is an amazing. It's a wonderland.
Yeah. Maybe.
I would agree. You should definitely make it up there.
Now, I had asked the question about Texas.
Sure.
So admittedly, Texas wines are a hit and miss, but I was just curious, do you remember the name of the wine that you did like from Texas?
Yes, it was actually Dave Feeney's, I think he called it TX, his location project. Dave Finney is the original winemaker at Prisoner and Orange Swift, and he's making a side project called Locations. And that Locations project, he believes that he makes great wines from a specific location with the grapes that are grown in that general region, whether it's Argentina, Spain, France, California, New Zealand for Sauvignon Blanc. And he makes a wine from Texas. And it was actually, I won't say actually, but it was pretty good. Like I said, I've got Texas customers in here that swear there's good Texas wine. It's hard for somebody in California to venture off into Texas. I know there's wine in Texas and Idaho, Virginia, but
thanks, Simon.
Grape
specific. New York wine.
Well, we tried New York.
We tried New York wine.
No.
That was a bad experience.
I love New York wine.
Yeah.
Sal, when's the next wine tasting with you?
I don't know, Evan. Are we doing one with me or?
Are you doing the one on the 28th?
I'm not sure. I know I'm doing a wine tasting. We're featuring wines this week from Wines from the Northwest. So I know I'm going to be on Wines from the Northwest wine tasting for my customers here who are buying the wines from the Northwest. Featuring, I think we got 3 from Oregon and 3 from Washington. Trying to support the folks up in the North. Trying to give you guys a little love and attention. But as far as the next one with you guys, I think if we're going to do something, we'd have to coordinate with the fine folks at CMC. But back to the New York, there's great wine in New York. Dry Riesling, Finger Lakes, gorgeous wines. You have to like these.
No, I'm a New Yorker. You can't compare the wine from any of it. From Spain, we were at your wine tasting, Sal, at Parents Weekend in February. Australian wines, New York. Let's just be honest. I mean, I'm a New Yorker, a 3rd generation New Yorker. Let's not drink New York wine. Come on. Come on.
It's pointless.
There's no reason.
Just say no.
Let's say no. Just say no. Yeah.
I agree. I mean,
there isn't a lot, but there are a few. I think there's more great New York wine than there are Texas wine. Sorry.
Stop to talk about Texas wine. That's insanity. Like nothing personal, but come on. California, Spain, Australia. We don't need to go to New York or Texas. Forget about it.
Yeah. What about New Zealand? I like how you're just so.
That would be a tough class. I would struggle to fill up the time with New York wine class. I would struggle. That would be a tough one. Yeah, Texas wine, that'd be a 10-minute class, but there's some good ones. That'd be great.
10-minute class.
Oh, wow.
Italian wine would be the next one. I'm loving Italian and Spanish wine right now.
What about in the U.S., Sal? Is there any new up-and-coming U.S. Regions for wine?
Up and coming, Michigan sparkling wine. Michigan sparkling is supposed to be the next great stuff. I haven't had them yet. New Mexico and Arizona. Arizona is making great Italian varietals, Nebbiolo, Sangiovese, dry, hot climate. I think Arizona is going to make great wine in the next 10 years. Yeah, I strongly believe they finally figured out how to farm out there. In terms of quality, the problem with farming is that you've always been taught that if you have more bananas, you're going to make more money. That doesn't translate the same with grapes and wine. More is not always better. And you're not always going to make more money with more grapes. They finally, the Arizona wine producers finally convinced their farmers that if you give me less grapes, I will pay you more money. And that just didn't make sense for a number of people, but they're going to start making great wine coming forward. So I believe it.
Yeah.
We got a question in the chat, by the way. Sal, how can I find a great wine for under $50 from Rioja as a gift? What clues can I look for?
Unfortunately, I think the best thing for you to look at in terms of finding a great wine for under $50 is Gran Reserva #1, but look for the added names behind the word Gran Reserva. Gran Reserva Especial, Gran Reserva Selección, Gran Reserva with a name behind it. We like to think that if you put your name on it, you're going to find great quality.
Half what you got.
Ring true in Spain. Muga has a name with a wine from Gran Reserva with the founder's name on it. Murrieta has a wine with the founder's name on it. 50 becomes a very weird break point. that I'll be honest, 50 is really, really hard. You'll find great wines under 30 and above 60. But there's a weird vacuum between that 40 and $60 market where I probably have one in that price range, but I have a lot at 60 and above, and a lot at 30 and below. 50 is a weird one, and it's one of those weird things where I don't want to raise my $30 price just to sell you a $45 bottle of wine. Yes. Look for Gran Reserva blank and find what that blank is and see if that helps. You might get lucky there. And when it comes to Spain, I don't want to bash anyone, but Jeb Genowick, don't listen to him. If you see any wine with Jeb, we call him Generous Jeb. He gives everything 95, 97 points. It's horrible. So if you see us, for those of us that follow scores, like, wow, that got 97 points, it must be good. Jeb is just giving scores away in Spain. He's just, I don't know if he's getting a free vineyard or what, but I don't trust him in Spain.
Now,
again, I'm not bashing anyone, I just, people.
Could you talk about Humia?
Oh, Humia's got great value.
Because that's really, those are really the Spanish wines that we drink mostly.
La Mancha, Humia, I mean, there is value there. $15, you're going to get some of the best wines you'll drink for $15 out of Humia. $15 to $20, I mean, the difference is those are fruitful. I love Rioja because I love older tasting wines, tertiary, earthy characteristics, kind of more barnyardy, if you would. Humia is all fruit. If you like Paso, you'll love Humia. If you like Zin, you'll love Humia. So Humia and La Mancha is another region within Spain that has great value, but the quality and the style of wine is completely different. It's fruit driven and high alcohol. Humia, you're looking at 14.5 to 15.5 alcohol. So they got a good kick, good fruit flavor. But yeah, good wines if you like fruit. I like them, but I don't love fruit. I don't like Paso wines myself. It's not my palate. It's not generally what I navigate towards. But yeah, those wines. And then same with Priorat. Priorat, if for the question that came in as far as Tempranillo and Cab, Priorat and Cab, hand in hand. If you love Cab, try a Tempranillo-based wine from Priorat. It'll blow a Cab away. It's incredible for the money. So that's the difficulty with Tempranillo in Spain. It tastes like chicken in one place, tastes like steak in another place. Completely different.
I think you have a question from Josh Walter in the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, I didn't have one, but I did have one. Evan, you read my mind. What would you guys say is the best CMC affiliated wine?
Great question.
There's not a ton, but there's a handful.
Yeah.
Either owners or winemakers or somehow affiliated with CMC wines. What would you say is the best Claremont McKenna wine?
That's a question for Evan.
Evan and or Sal. And or Michelle, I know she was sneaking around back there.
Chris Streeter.
Chris Streeter, but he's Harvey Mudd, so.
Affiliated.
A mud.
Mudder.
I can't believe you're making me pick between CMCers. I love them all so much.
Well, I know it's a hard. How about your? Well, one you would recommend. Your
yeah. So Chris, we are big fans of Chris Streeter and Census Wines. The March 28th tasting we're doing is with Meyer Family Cellars, which is Tony Poor, class of 90. He's the national sales manager, and Chris Streeter, founder of Census Wines. And here's Michelle. Those two are great. We also have Mount Beautiful out of New Zealand. We have Scheid Family Wines out of Monterey. We have Red Car.
I didn't know the New Zealand
Mount Beautiful. That's it's a parent and of course the son just graduated from CMC, so it's a CMC family wine. Mount Beautiful, which Sal does sell at the shop. He sells the Sauv Blanc here. They also have a Pinot Noir and a Chardonnay. Census is Pinot. Yeah, the Sauv Blanc is a killer price. Mm-hmm. But so March 28th will be with Chris Streeter and Tony Poor, and then I would like to bring Sal back if you all will join us again. But you mentioned the Northwest tasting. I think some people want you to share that with this group. So Sal, if you're willing, we'll of course share any information with this group as a follow-up. But you can email Sal at Packing House Wines if you do want any information on future virtual tastings too from the shop.
He wouldn't be gravitated toward them, but he doesn't like that. We can have a strips wine tasting.
Sal, you're on mute. What happened?
let me get there. Josh, I'm gonna Mount Beautiful for 13 bucks. That Sauvignon Blanc is absolutely amazing.
13 bucks. How
That
does
is a CMC. It is, yeah, between the glass and shipping it here, it should be 13.
Right. It's almost impossible to be able to buy a bottle of wine from New Zealand, knowing the bottle, the labeling, the wine, like the shipping, everything that goes into it. How can I buy a bottle for $13?
It's amazing. The wine is delicious. I enjoy Chris's wines, and for those of you that know Chris or know our relationship, he used to work for me while he was a student here, and he and I am his biggest critic. I expect nothing but perfection from him. So every time I test his wine, I probably am the meanest person to him. But I think he makes amazing wines. Thomas Brown, his winemaker, is very good, but his Pinot Noirs are delicious, but they're not cheap. Mount Beautiful is incredible. Mayor, when you run into, when you meet up with Tony, if you guys are gonna do that wine, they used to make a wine called Bonnie's Vineyard, which was to die for, that they no longer make, or I think it's limited production, but it's like 150 a bottle. It should be great. So those are my top 3 for whatever it's worth there.
Mount Beautiful. I'll have to look for Mount Beautiful. Is it distributed pretty widely?
They make quite a bit. It's in a twist off. It's easy drinker, and 13 to 15 bucks depending on your market. It's just put it in the glass and drink it. And that also got good love. I think last year it was in the top 100 with Wine Spectator's list.
Huh. Was that, were they, Evan, and Michelle's freaking out, what's going on? It turns out, if anyone's on this, Marisa and Michelle are friends. I don't know if you guys could figure that out. So, who was Mount Beautiful? The kid went to CMC. Was he from New Zealand and he went to CMC?
From the Bay Area.
And they happen to have a winery in New Zealand?
Correct.
Investment.
An investment in, okay. Okay. That's cool.
That's amazing.
It is. Nice.
Redcar still has a family association with CMC? Oh, still. Those are good too, I hear.
Yeah. Well, with that, it is 7 o'clock, and I know Sal's got some work to do. So thank you, everyone, so much. Great to see everyone. We look forward to future wine tastings. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for joining us on a tour through Spain, and I'll work with Sal on what we can do for the next one.
Thank you, guys. I know I'm mute, but thank you.
Yay! Good to see everybody.
Go Stags and Athenas.
Yes.
All right, I'm gonna close up last. Let Michelle.
Bye, everyone.
Then a virtual wine